This lecture is going to be about theme parks, and I'm going to refer to this quite excellent collection that came out several years ago called Inside the Mouse. My focus will be on Disney parks, but it has relevance to practically all major theme parks. So you might ask the question, why would we want to talk about theme parks? Well, I think there are two reasons. One is they are intrinsically fascinating, at least to me. Um, and they just kind of strange. They're also just very weird places. Um, and they're weird because they promote the idea that the simulacra, or the fake, if you like, is better than the real thing. And they encapsulate a major cultural shift that has been underway since at least the 1950s, depending on who you ask, away from the real and the authentic toward the hyper-real and the inauthentic. Um, so this is kind of a lecture about cultural values and the way that cultural values are formulated and the way they affect us in everyday life. In 1971, the literary critic Lionel Trilling published a book called Sincerity and Authenticity. And he dated the emergence of authenticity as a central cultural concern in Europe at the start of the 20th century. And his key exhibit was Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which he claims turns on the question of what it means to be authentic. So, for instance, does Kurtz become more or less authentic when he goes native, to use the phrase of the period? And the answer will obviously depend on how one defines authenticity. For Trilling, authenticity is a state of being true to oneself and to one's cultural values. And this meaning obviously still holds, and you can think about this in fairly nationalistic terms. What does it mean to be a true Australian or true Brit or whatever? Um, and the understanding of authenticity assumes that there are a set of external reference points one can just tick off to validate one's sense of self as authentic. So if you're a true Australian, then you drink beer, you call women Sheilas, and you drive a Holden and you watch footy or whatever the current criteria are now. And most of our advertising taps into this sense that there are these kinds of pure signifiers of a particular kind of authenticity relating to one's nationality. And the other permutation of this idea of authenticity is to be found in D.H. Lawrence, writing a couple of decades later than Conrad. For Lawrence, authenticity was a matter of experience. The only authentic experiences were those that derived from the instincts, i.e., they were pre-modern. And the famous sex scenes in Lady Chatterley's Lover, whether it's the book or the film, all involve the scattering of flowers and running naked through the woods. In other words, sex itself is only authentic if it also involves a communion with nature. So, why might this particular cultural value emerge at this point in history, at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century? And obviously, there are going to be a variety of factors at work, but the ones that tend to be singled out by cultural studies pioneers like Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart is the transition from agrarian capitalism to industrial capitalism, which began in the 1840s and peaked somewhere around the 1950s when we transitioned from there to financial capitalism. So, in the course of that century, several key things happened to bring about a major cultural transformation. This is predominantly in Europe. Large numbers of landless farm labourers moved to the city to become factory workers. These workers became wage earners. Previously, their payment had been in kind in the form of food and housing and so on, and now they received money for which they had to figure out their own housing and food. The city dwellers relied on purchased goods. They didn't make their own butter, bread, or cloth as their rural ancestors had. The cities grew large rapidly. People were separated from their families and forced to live amongst strangers. Factory work was unchanging, unaffected by seasons and weather, and even sunlight. And obviously, the list goes on. But you get the basic point, which is that life lost contact with the earth, as it were, with nature, and as a consequence, lost contact with everything that felt authentic to the generation of people who looked back on farm life, which in many cases they'd never actually experienced, um, with nostalgia. And we see the same thing in Australia, which still regards itself as kind of rural, even though less than 5% of the population live in rural areas. The surrogate form of authenticity of this type for Conrad and Lawrence and others was travel, particularly if it was to distant ports that were as yet undeveloped. And both Conrad and Lawrence travelled extensively. Lawrence, of course, even lived in Australia briefly, and Conrad visited here, and one of his boats sank in Hobart, although not when he was captain. Travel remains a source of authenticity for many people today, particularly if you go to so-called traditional cultures and countries. And the pattern here is that inauthentic is what we have as modern people, and the authentic is what we have lost. Today, it seems authenticity is seen as something that can be reproduced, though, and cooking shows seem to be particularly strong on this point. So you can make authentic Italian pasta, authentic Indian curry, authentic Mexican food, and so on. Now, theme parks then take this idea of authenticity a step further and offer the incredibly paradoxical authentic reproduction. So, authentic is a privileged point, if you like, that enables us to look at a whole way of life, giving way to one another, and it seems to resurface as an idea that each new epoch comes to a close. And the point I'm trying to make here is that what's crucial isn't whether something is authentic or not, but why and in what way does that classification matter? Why do we care about whether it's authentic or not? And this, I think, is the key question we should ask of every cultural value that we encounter. Now, if authenticity matters, it's because it yields a particular, still to be determined, gratification, which we might call pleasure, but we probably shouldn't be too hasty in calling it that. Pleasure, however, is one of the dominant explanations for almost all forms of cultural behavior within cultural studies. And it seems reasonable, but I don't think it's adequate. So if we say we go to theme parks just dressed as goofy because it gives us pleasure, it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't feel sufficient. We ride on roller coasters that make us sick, in my case anyway, because it gives us pleasure. And again, that doesn't really seem adequate. So within cultural studies, then, pleasure has always been treated as both a problem and an answer. Like it seems to answer a number of the questions that we have, but by itself, it also needs to be questioned. So pleasure is a crucial and critical problem for cultural studies to look at because of its explanatory power, but also because of the problems it raises. And my point is that we must question the assumption that pleasure does, in fact, explain anything. And this is one of Deleuze and Guattari's great contributions to actually challenge the idea that pleasure is a way of explaining cultural behavior. As Susan Willis has pointed out, the question is particularly poignant in the case of Disney because the pleasures it proposes to afford us are of the rigorously desexualized variety. She argues it's not even particularly carnivalesque in Bakhtein's sense. Um, Disney's suppression of the carnivalesque, she says, is consistent with the larger pattern of the rise of the bourgeoisie, which tried to carve out a niche for itself that was distinct from the traditions of the past. So for Bakhtin, the carnivalesque belongs to the medieval times. Paradoxically, even as Disney stamps out the carnivalesque, the overturning of a political order is Bakhtin's definition, it actively promotes the grotesque. As she points out, kids are often freaked out by the giant Mickey Mouse and so forth walking around. I know when I took my kids when they were very little, they were freaked out by the giant creatures. Um, Pleasure is perhaps a screen then for a sort of utopian longing, the carnivalesque as a social rupture. And Disney projects an image of a perfect world, a world cleansed of everything that is distasteful. And famously, no one can die in Disney because if you do, put you in an ambulance and rush you out of the postcode. This utopian pleasure is not merely sensual and cognitive, it is also political. The cleansed world is one in which a range of normal elements of daily life have been deliberately purged. Um, so Willis argues then that the pleasure of Disney, whatever it is far from an innocent pleasure. And she says it is also a paradoxical pleasure inasmuch as it is highly capitalistic and commercial, but projects a powerful image of being the opposite of that. It's all medieval castles, reciprocity, we're all in this together, and so on. And there is an element of the true carnival in Disney, as much as it projects an image of plenitude, of springtime feasting rather than winter fasting. So the word carnival actually comes from the festival of eating meat, Khan, at the end of winter, getting ready for spring. Not only that, the people who used to go to Disney are what gives it its atmosphere. Without the crowds, it would seem joyless and dull. And we pay money then in order to help generate money for Disney. We go in as customers, but in a way function as unpaid workers. Our happy contributes a kind of affective labor. So we too consume the crowd that we are part of, that we produce and we populate, and that also helps us to enjoy what we're there to do. And of course, the crowds can be massive, and then we also then find them forbidding and annoying and pay extra in order to avoid them. So again, it's kind of paradoxical. Ultimately, we might go so far as to say the crowds are the truth of the park. Everything else is fake, but the crowd is real. It's not the only truth, of course, but it is perhaps the only one we can readily see. Perhaps the least visible truth in Disney is the fact that for people who work there, it's actually labor and not just magic. The people are paid to be there. They're not customers. They don't really enjoy it. And it has often been described as a terrible job. The park is a highly controlled place in which all messaging is carefully controlled. The employees are allowed to smoke on the job and so on. We don't hear about accidents such as people being eaten by alligators and so forth, all of which has happened but is carefully hushed up. And so, work at Disney then is typical of the trend today in that it helped to pioneer a model of labor that is highly controlled, de-skilled, focused on affect and performance, flexible in terms of its contract, and rigorously impermanent. So Disney workers have to work to a script. The interaction with customers is carefully contrived to keep alive the magic. And the more on show the workers are, the less they are paid. And of course, in the background, then you have the fact that Disney's CEO is paid in the tens of millions, a factor of many thousands times the lowest paid employer. The park is also a mall. You pay to get in, but once you're there, you keep paying. The rides are free, but the food and the merchandise certainly isn't. In fact, one might even say that the park merely creates the right mood to promote the purchase of the massively overpriced food and merchandise. And this is perhaps the lesson of television because TV content creates the mood and attitude conducive to shopping, and the park follows the same principle. Susan Willis describes the park and mall, as it were, as being like the Philip K. Dick novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which became the film Blade Runner, in which the real has been replaced by the simulacra. No real animals, only robotic replicants. Even feelings are artificially generated. The park eliminates spontaneity. Everything is pre-planned, pre-scheduled, designed to ensure the distribution and movements of large numbers of people. And we tend to think of it fun then as being relaxed, but as the opposite of work. But at Disney, it occurs according to routines and the timetabling of machines. It's a giant sort of logistics of affect. And mind you, what you mostly do at Disney is stand in queues. At the park, your memories are commodities. Every ride has a money shot that you can buy afterwards. Souvenirs are also part of the totemic reminders. And the most potent reminder of all is, of course, the Disney logo. And one might say the park exists to give the logo its substance. But one could also say the park only exists because the logo is itself so powerful. But reiterating Willis, who argues that Disney is actually an anti-carnival. It is Fordist, she says, rather interested in efficiency and the sublime of machines. For example, the World Fair of 1851, with its great Crystal Palace, which created the tropics in London, is as much a feat of engineering as imagination. And Disney's Imagineers, as they call themselves, follows this pattern too. It uses technology to create the apparently impossible. The world fairs of old were showcases for capital designed to create new markets for manufactured materials. They grew in scale such that they became mini cities. And the fairs projected a utopian world in which all the world's problems could be solved by technology. And Disney's Epcot would be a contemporary example of what this looks like. New materials and new gadgets would constantly improve lives. And World Fairs also connected with the Garden City movement and pushed for a kind of mutation in the built environment, which the Disney parks realized. The Disney world today is a perfect example of the Garden City. So, like the World Fair, Disney is a kind of a destination. One goes to see it, but one also goes to see the simulacra of somewhere else. So, when you go to Disney, it has replicas of other parts of the world. Um, and so it's always paradoxical. It's that authentic replication. How authentic its simulations seem or feel depends, of course, on one's prior knowledge of the referent. And for a lot of kids, this is obviously zero. So the simulacra feels more real than the real thing could. And all the rides at Disney are voyages too. They all take you on a journey. Um, and the sort of connection to merchandise and the sort of imaginative world itself that goes back to the television point is worth thinking about because it's phenomenally successful. Disney's most successful merchandise product is the Disney Princess series, and sales of Disney Princess merch exceeds 5.5 billion per year. So phenomenal number of Disney princesses being sold. The question that it raises, of course, is what makes them so popular? How do they differ from Barbie or Bratz or whatever? And part of the answer has to do with the ways by which they're bedded into films, which clearly function as something other than just sheer entertainment. They create imaginative universes which the children participate in and want to extend by buying toys. And I talk about some of this stuff in my book on assemblage theory, relating it to Lightning McQueen, not a Disney princess, of course, but I think the same principle applies. So Disney then is the ultimate example of a corporation dedicated to creating the consumerist mood. And what needs to be explained more and what we want to think about, and I'm just kind of leaving you with this thought, is the way by which watching a film seems to call for the supplementary um, endeavor to need to buy something. It's like kids can't watch Frozen or Lightning McQueen or whatever without also needing a lunchbox or a backpack or something else that they can buy and wear as a kind of mascot.